The humid summer air of the stone house in San Antonio clung to the surface of the entryway floor. The deep cracks in the foundation radiated a persistent, damp chill. This chill seeped directly into the soles of Clara Vance's bare feet. She stood completely motionless in the center of the hallway. Her body was positioned with a rigid, unnatural verticality. This posture was designed to protect the fragile, healing line of her abdominal incision from the sudden, jarring movements of her infant daughter. Emma was only 12 days old. She emitted a high-frequency, piercing sound that vibrated directly against the cartilage of Clara's collarbone. This sensory assault intensified the sharp, throbbing pressure behind her eyelids after weeks of interrupted sleep. Her right hand remained firmly cupped against the back of the infant's neck. She felt the rapid, erratic rhythm of the child's pulse under the soft, thin skin. The left hand was pressed firmly against the heavy fabric of her loose sweatpants. This action provided a layer of mechanical support to the deep internal stitches. Those stitches felt as though they might pull apart with every shallow intake of breath. The surrounding atmosphere was heavy and motionless. It was filled with the stale scent of partially dried formula and the overwhelming artificial aroma of citrus-scented cleaning fluid. Clara had scrubbed this fluid into the entryway earlier that evening. The early morning light from the kitchen remained a distant, non-existent memory. This left the house in a state of suspended, suffocating darkness. The dark was periodically illuminated by the frantic, changing colors of the television screen in the living room. On that screen, the sports broadcast played on an endless loop. Every muscle in Clara's lower back ached with a dull, persistent intensity. This physical feedback loop was caused by the repetitive, hours-long cycle of rocking, feeding, and shifting weight. She did this constantly to avoid compressing the sensitive tissue of her recovering body. She kept her eyes fixed on the precise spot where the hardwood floor met the baseboard. She watched a single, microscopic speck of dust drift through the air in the path of the television light. Her entire physical state was characterized by extreme, managed fatigue. She could feel the individual fibers of her worn Air Force shirt scratching against the hypersensitive surface of her skin. Each movement created a subtle, grating friction. This friction served as a constant reminder of the physical cost of her current existence. The house itself felt alive with an oppressive, heavy stillness. The only movement was the rhythmic, almost mechanical expansion of her own ribcage. The sharp, gasping cries of the child seemed trapped in a cycle of immediate, unceasing demand for attention. Clara analyzed the structural reality of her marriage with the same cold, detached precision she employed when auditing technical maintenance logs at the airfield. Within her mind, she cataloged the behaviors of Arthur Radcliffe as a series of predictable, recurring system failures. Each failure was meticulously designed to maintain his own comfort at the expense of the stability of their shared environment. He possessed an uncanny, almost mathematical ability to identify the precise moment of her maximum vulnerability. This early hour was the exact moment when her physical endurance was at its absolute minimum. His decision to depart for a luxury trip to the Maldives with his social circle was not an impulsive error. It was a calculated tactical maneuver intended to remove himself from the immediate, chaotic requirements of newborn care. She understood that his refusal to consider her post-surgical limitations was not a failure of empathy. It was a deliberate validation of his belief that his own temporal needs surpassed the survival requirements of his own family unit. Clara mentally mapped the legal landscape of their property. She acknowledged that the stone house in San Antonio was purchased long before their union. She had used an inheritance from her mother and the accumulated savings from her years of service in the aviation logistics division. Under the separate property rights defined by the laws of the state of Texas, this dwelling was not a shared marital asset. Yet Arthur acted with the casual entitlement of an owner. He continuously suggested that his own financial comfort was a direct product of her success. She felt no surge of anger, only a chilling diagnostic clarity. She realized that her professional competence as a quality auditor was being systematically utilized against her. He had constructed a domestic narrative where she was the invincible, efficient machine of the household. This label excused him from providing support, while simultaneously rendering her invisible to the very system he was exploiting for his own benefit. The betrayal was not a singular event. It was a continuous, systemic degradation of her agency. This entire exploitation had been masked behind the polite, public-facing rituals of a successful upper-middle-class marriage. The sharp, sudden sound of Arthur dragging his heavy, polycarbonate suitcase across the hardwood floor created a harsh, discordant frequency. This noise seemed to slice through the already frantic crying of the infant. He walked toward the front entrance with an easy, fluid grace. His linen shirt was crisp and unwrinkled. His new sunglasses dangled from the collar of his shirt, as if he were preparing to step onto a private deck rather than an airport shuttle. When Clara asked him to postpone his departure by even 7 days to allow her incision to begin the final stage of cellular knitting, Arthur did not look at her. He focused intently on the glow of his cellular device instead. He spoke in a flat, monotone register that was completely devoid of emotional inflection. He explained that the non-refundable nature of his airline booking rendered any modification to his schedule a financial impossibility. When she pressed him again, his tone hardened. He reminded her that she had successfully managed complex deployments and emergency logistics operations in high-stress environments. He implied that the care of a single infant was an inferior challenge in comparison. He leaned down, touching 2 fingers to the forehead of the child in a performative gesture. It looked as though it were being enacted for the benefit of a hidden camera. This artificial demonstration of paternal care failed to disguise the lack of any authentic connection. Clara felt a somatic reaction in her own chest. A tightening of the muscles around her solar plexus made it difficult to maintain the necessary posture to support Emma. She wanted to detail the physiological reality of the C-section. She wanted to explain the exact mechanics of the internal healing process. She wanted to demonstrate that her professional history in aviation maintenance did not grant her a biological immunity to the requirements of physical recovery. Instead, she remained silent. She watched the cold, distant expression on his face as he continued to prioritize his travel itinerary over the clear medical distress signals emanating from his own daughter. The contrast between his polished outward appearance and the internal chaos of her own recovery was absolute. This disparity was becoming impossible to reconcile with any sense of shared marital purpose or mutual commitment. The rideshare vehicle pulled away from the curb at 4:47 in the morning. The harsh, white light of the departing taillights cut through the lingering darkness of the neighborhood. This left the front yard in a sudden, unsettling gloom. Clara stood by the threshold of the open door, watching the vehicle accelerate down the street until the glow of its lights vanished entirely. This left behind only the deep, silent void of the Texas night. The immediate, jarring transition from the possibility of his presence to the finality of his departure triggered a sudden, uncontrollable surge of physical exhaustion. This exhaustion almost collapsed her knees. Emma sensed the sudden change in rhythm. She began to cough and choke, finally spitting a warm, viscous stream of formula down the front of Clara's Air Force t-shirt. The liquid soaked quickly through the fabric to reach the tender, inflamed skin of her surgical site. The sharp, burning pain flared instantly, but she did not cry out. Instead, She performed the necessary, practiced movements to keep the child upright. Her hands worked on automatic pilot to restore the fragile equilibrium of their environment. She turned back into the hallway. The sound of the house settled into an oppressive silence that felt much heavier than it had before he left. She retreated into the quiet, dark space of the nursery. The only movement there was the soft, mechanical swinging of the bassinet. The only sound was the shallow, breathless rhythm of her own labored breathing. Every piece of furniture in the house seemed to cast a long, accusing shadow. The air felt thick with the weight of the tasks she would now have to complete without a single moment of pause or professional assistance. She sat down in the nursing recliner. The chair made a soft, compressed groan under her weight. She began the process of feeding, changing, and soothing the child once again. Her movements were stripped of any excess motion. Her focus narrowed completely to the immediate, biological requirements of the life she held in her arms. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. It was a massive, unyielding space that marked the total termination of her domestic expectations and the beginning of a cold, solitary audit of her own existence. Clara Vance waited for the sun to rise. Her eyes tracked the slow, imperceptible change in the color of the room, from deep charcoal to a thin, sickly shade of gray. Outside, the neighborhood remained entirely still. The nocturnal insects had ceased their chirping, leaving the environment in a state of total, featureless anticipation. She looked out toward the window. Her gaze passed through the glass to the silhouette of the old oak trees that stood like silent sentinels against the horizon. The sharp light of the morning sun began to creep over the roof of the adjacent property. The pale golden rays hit the edge of the curtains and slowly, inevitably, filled the room with a cold, unforgiving illumination. She stood up slowly, her body feeling brittle, and walked to the nursery window, resting her forehead against the glass. The air on the other side of the pane was already heating up. The promise of a long, punishing day ahead was reflected in the relentless clarity of the rising sun. She did not look at the phone on the bassinet table, nor did she reach for it. Her attention was focused entirely on the empty street below and the quiet, structured order of the world that she would now have to navigate alone. The house around her seemed to hold its breath. It waited for the first sound of the new, solitary order she would construct from the wreckage of the last 12 days. There was no sound left to make, and no one remaining to hear it. The small yellow glow from the nursery nightlight cast a weak warmth across the dark walnut wood of the dining table. A faint layer of dust settled over Clara Vance's fingertips as she pressed her right palm flat against the cool surface. Her 28-year-old body remained completely rigid. She sat on the edge of the wooden chair while her left hand rhythmically adjusted the hard plastic pump shield against her breast. She felt the dull electric pulse of the machine send a uniform vibration through her collarbone. The internal temperature of the room fluctuated around 24 degrees Celsius, but the air felt heavy. It carried the sour smell of spilled formula mixed with the dry, metallic scent of the electronic terminal warming up beside her laptop. A sharp, stinging throb continued to hum directly beneath her surgical dress. There, the vertical line of her 12-day-old incision reacted to every heavy breath she took in the silence. From the portable bassinet near the wall, Emma's shallow, sleeping gasps marked the time. This was accompanied by the slow, heavy drag of her father's right foot moving across the kitchen linoleum down the hall. Richard Vance moved with an agonizing slowness. The mechanical friction of his arthritic hip joint created a dull clicking noise that broke the midnight quiet at steady intervals. Clara did not turn her head to watch him. Her eyes remained fixed on the white digital spreadsheet illuminating her face. Her respiration was entirely regular as she controlled the physical feedback of her exhaustion. This domestic fortress had become a technical processing zone, where Clara evaluated the risk coefficients of her economic survival with the cold logic of an aerospace quality auditor. Her mind separated the immediate physical variables from the deep financial irregularities appearing within the household ledger. She translated Arthur's sudden silence into an active adversarial maneuver. The rejection of the joint debit card on loop 1604 during a desperate run for supplies had confirmed her initial diagnostic fears regarding his transactional behavior. A total sum of exactly $18,000 had been systematically siphoned from their emergency savings account. This extraction left their primary household engine completely dry while she recovered from surgery. She did not allow her internal systems to trigger a standard emotional panic response. Instead, her logistics training allowed her to map this structural betrayal as a series of calculated steps designed to compromise her defense. She understood that Arthur had treated her recovery period as a window of non-regulation. He assumed that the physical constraints of caring for a newborn would prevent her from executing a baseline audit of his administrative movements. Her focus narrowed to the digital path left by his unauthorized access. She recognized that the missing $18,000 was merely a primary indicator of a much larger structural threat aimed directly at her personal real estate holdings. The slow, dragging footsteps grew louder as Richard Vance entered the dining space. His 72-year-old frame bent slightly forward as he deposited a heavy plastic container of infant supplies onto the table with stiff, trembling fingers. He adjusted his small reading glasses, his breathing heavy as he looked at the bright matrix on the laptop, before asking in a low, gravelly voice if the financial reports confirmed her initial audit of the joint accounts. Clara kept her voice entirely level. She explained that the system logs revealed a massive unauthorized extraction that occurred precisely 6 days ago, concurrent with his departure preparations. She detailed the exact technical metrics of the balance sheet, showing that the primary savings had been reduced to a value of $0 without her administrative approval or signature. Richard leaned against the back of the chair. His jaw tightened as his knuckles turned a pale color against the dark wood. His body exhibited a clear somatic response to the details of his son-in-law's deception. He spoke in a metered, quiet tone, stating that a man who steals from the cradle will eventually dismantle the house itself. His words carried the simple authority of a veteran who recognized an existential threat to the family perimeter. Clara nodded once. Her fingers continued to input data into the verification columns, her physical presence remaining flat as she documented the technical timeline for the attorney. The discovery of the primary forgery occurred at precisely 2 o'clock in the morning as Clara initiated a deep administrative search through the joint email server's deleted items archive. Her index finger depressed the master enter key, executing a retrieval script that unburied a series of encrypted communications between Arthur Radcliffe and a corporate mortgage broker linked to Gordon Bellamy. The file contained an unauthorized digital document titled Power of Attorney. It bore a digital copy of her signature that had been mapped onto the ledger page from an old aviation maintenance authorization sheet. The document established a fraudulent transaction structure where Arthur claimed the legal right to execute a cross-collateralization refinance on the Stonehouse, setting up an absolute liability boundary. The contract details showed that he had created a fixed monthly penalty agreement of $48,000 multiplied by 12 months, establishing a total fake obligation of $576,000. This massive financial trap was engineered to place her separate property into an immediate default status. This would allow the secondary entity to seize the deed and transfer the underlying equity into an account controlled by Victoria Radcliffe. The metadata attached to the file indicated that the electronic signature had been processed from a device utilizing an Internet Protocol address registered at the luxury resort in the Maldives. This provided a clear geographic stamp of the fraud. The terminal display settled into an inactive, cold blue coloration as the automated audit protocol completed its verification sequence. This confirmed the absolute validity of the cryptographic chain of custody. The quiet that filled the dining room was now massive and heavy. It was completely uninterrupted by the sound of the pump machine, which had completed its timed cycle, leaving the space completely motionless under the dim yellow light. Outside the window, the heavy Texas mist hung low over the oak trees of San Antonio. The dark landscape was completely silent as the city waited for the first break of dawn. Clara slowly closed the primary interface casing of her laptop. The click of the latch provided a definitive, physical punctuation to her midnight investigation. She looked down at the photocopied deed of her home. This was her separate property, purchased with her mother's legacy, now securely protected within her logistics file, alongside the audited metadata logs. Her physical breathing was slow and measured. Her jaw was locked in a flat line of technical certainty as she prepared to submit the entire dossier to the Bexar County District Attorney under the federal guidelines. There was no remaining doubt in her calculations. She had successfully established an indestructible chain of evidence that would completely dismantle Arthur's fantasy of ownership before the system could enforce his fraudulent parameters. The cold aluminum edge of the laboratory table pressed continuously against the small of Clara Vance's lower back, sending a dull, localized ache straight up through her spinal cord. Her right forearm lay perfectly flat on the steel surface. Her fingers maintained a static 45-degree position over the tracking console for 2 consecutive hours without a single break. The ambient air inside the subterranean logistics audit annex of Randolph Air Force Base was kept at an uncomfortably chilly 18 degrees Celsius. Yet the faint, biting draft from the ceiling vents carried the dry, mechanical scent of ozone and freshly printed material ledger sheets. A persistent, rhythmic throbbing centered directly behind her left ear. This was a physical reaction to 72 hours of tracking supply databases under the harsh, blue-spectrum glare of the triple monitor terminal. Her left arm moved with absolute, calculated slowness. Her fingertips dragged over the coarse texture of the steel desk to trace the physical boundaries of her digital folders. Through the reinforced security window of the secure annex, the vast San Antonio airfield landscape lay wrapped in absolute winter darkness. The heavy silence was only broken by the distant, low-frequency hum of a transport aircraft idling on the nearby runway tarmac. Clara did not blink. Her eyes remained locked on the terminal display, where the glowing blue interface lines cast a cold, mathematical reflection across her cheekbones. Her breathing was completely leveled as she slowly slid her master military authentication card into the slot of the external reader. This technical fortress served as the perfect clinical screen to insulate her from the deceptive domestic narrative that Arthur Radcliffe had constructed inside their home. Clara Vance evaluated the systemic betrayal with the detached precision of an aviation maintenance quality auditor, stripping away the emotional weight of her ruined marriage to focus purely on the forensic data points. Her family law attorney, Angela Ruiz, had been exceptionally clear during their brief meeting. She warned Clara that she must not confront her husband until she possessed an airtight, audited chain of custody that could survive a federal defense challenge. Any premature exposure of her suspicion would simply allow Arthur to deploy his polished public relations defense. He would readily utilize his volunteer standing and his friendly social reputation to paint her as unstable. He had spent years constructing a flawless public mask, but his financial movements left a distinct electronic footprint that he lacked the technical expertise to fully conceal. Clara calculated the operational risks of his fraud, realizing that the house she had bought before marriage was being systematically targeted to fund an external entity under his direct control. the psychological pressure of keeping her discovery hidden while sharing a space with him was immense. However, her military-quality audit training allowed her to keep her somatic responses entirely flat. She understood that the deceptive signatures and the over-invoiced receipts were not simple administrative errors. They were the deliberate mechanics of an economic siege designed to strip her of her financial independence and keep her legally bound to his family liabilities. Clara picked up the secure office telephone receiver, establishing an encrypted voice connection to Angela Ruiz at her residence to lay out the parameters of the operation. She stated that the processing of the data confirmed that Arthur was attempting to circumvent the property laws of the state of Texas by creating a fraudulent administrative overlay. She detailed that the digital ledger showed he had worked with an outside source to design a fake contract that would automatically pull assets from her house without a standard title search. Angela Ruiz listened to the entire description through the encrypted line. Her breathing maintained a uniform rhythm before she advised Clara to stay inside the computer logs and avoid any text communication with Arthur. Clara responded that the tracking system was already tracing the origin of the digital signature. Her tongue pressed against the back of her front teeth to stabilize her voice as she outlined the next technical tracking steps. She explained that she had deployed a specialized forensic document ledger analysis script to verify the exact Internet Protocol addresses used to access the mortgage platform. Angela stated that if the audit could confirm that the digital authorization occurred while Arthur was physically located outside the United States, the defense would have no legal ground to claim that she had authorized the transaction. Clara nodded once into the dark room. Her fingers tightened slightly around the telephone's plastic casing as she affirmed that the security logs would be finalized before dawn. The database screen refreshed, displaying the complete transactional ledger of the corporate mortgage application that Arthur had submitted to the regional lender. Clara focused her attention on the billing codes, her voice quiet but flat as she read the digital receipts line by line into her private recording microphone. Arthur had utilized his administrative access to generate 12 separate, highly inflated maintenance invoices for security system upgrades that never occurred. The billing structure was a classic example of operational over-invoicing, where the service cost of $48,000 was charged monthly against her separate property for 12 consecutive months. This systematic extraction generated a total loss of exactly $576,000, a massive financial drain that moved directly through the nonprofit front. The system logs showed that the funds did not remain within the primary accounts. Instead, they were routed through electronic wire transfers directly into a private account held by her mother-in-law, Victoria Radcliffe. This interstate movement of stolen assets officially pushed the fraud past the federal threshold. This elevated the local offense to a high-severity federal wire fraud violation under Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code. Clara felt her jaw muscles tighten as she documented the specific routing transit numbers. Her body experienced a cold spike of adrenaline that she immediately pushed down through sheer breathing control. She knew that the internal systems held absolute authority to audit transactions acting as fraudulent inducements. This technical evidence would serve as the primary legal anchor to sink the Radcliffe family assets. The final system logs settled into an inactive, blue-tinted display of codes, signaling the complete sealing of the technical perimeter around the Radcliffe household. The ambient noise within the logistics annex returned to the low, uniform whisper of the server cooling fans. The high-capacity processors slowly dropped their thermal output as the audit concluded. Outside the double-pane safety window, the first faint light of dawn was beginning to trace the cold, gray silhouette of the airfield water towers against the San Antonio horizon. The summer mist had transitioned into a silent, heavy humidity that clung to the military vehicles parked along the gravel perimeter of the base compound. Clara Vance stood up from her metal desk with deliberate care. Her movements were slow and measured as she gathered her security drives and placed them inside her jacket pocket. Her fingers felt cold, but her breathing was entirely calm. The technical structure of her plan provided a profound, unyielding sense of certainty. There was no remaining doubt in her mind. She had established an indestructible digital chain of custody that would survive any legal challenge Arthur's family could mount. She stepped toward the heavy security door, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the concrete floor as she walked out of the silent annex into the chilly morning air, leaving the dark machines behind to run their quiet, targeted programs. The sharp early morning Texas sun cut directly through the unwashed pane of the kitchen window, casting a long, geometric grid of pale amber light across the cold slate tiles of the floor panels. Clara Vance stood perfectly still beside the dark oak counter, her right palm resting flat against the cool, polished stone surface, feeling the subtle, rhythmic vibration of the refrigerator motor hum through her fingertips. The internal temperature of the large kitchen was kept at exactly 21 degrees Celsius, yet a thin, freezing draft from the hallway doorframe curled around her bare ankles, making the skin on her calves prickle with tiny goosebumps. A sharp, stinging sensation persisted continuously along the lower boundary of her left abdomen, where the vertical line of her 12-day-old surgical incision reacted to every heavy breath she drew in the stillness. The air inside the room carried the rich, cloying aroma of fresh, dark roast coffee grinds, but it was heavily undercut by the dry, chemical scent of lemon floor wax that Arthur had applied to mask the deep scuff marks from his suitcase wheels. Victoria Radcliffe sat exactly 4 feet away at the maple breakfast table, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a heavy mug, her chest moving in a slow, shallow pattern as she prepared to deliver another lecture on family loyalty. Clara did not break her gaze from the older woman's face, her eyes tracking the slight downward curve of her mouth as the bright sun illuminated the fine silver strands of hair near her temples. The ambient space carried no sound except the low, monotonous hum of an external air conditioning unit working outside the brick wall, dropping the moisture level of the house down to 40%. This clean domestic scene was the calculated screen Victoria used to mask the structural rot of her son's behavior. But Clara evaluated the older woman's posture with the icy, detached logic of an aviation maintenance quality auditor. Her mind functioned like a forensic document ledger, systematically cataloging Victoria's micro-expressions and weighing them against the technical risk variables she had established during her late-night network analysis. She knew that behind Victoria's comfortable, expensive knit cardigan lay the generational pride of the Radcliffe name, a social identity built entirely on public charity and neighborhood praise that was now heavily compromised by active system corruption. Victoria had arrived with the specific intent of enforcing traditional family parameters, pretending that a husband's sudden international travel was merely a minor adjustment, rather than an absolute operational failure. Clara's inner logic reprocessed the household ledger data with unyielding precision, calculating the exact statutory weight of the fraud Arthur had executed while she was incapacitated by surgery. She did not feel the typical panic of a spouse facing domestic betrayal. Instead, her logistics training allowed her to categorize Victoria's lectures as predictable noise within a failing system that was about to experience a terminal correction. She watched the older woman take a slow, deliberate breath, her internal system remaining entirely flat as she waited for the primary electronic intercept to activate on the terminal. The silence broke when the cellular device on the table emitted a sharp, high-frequency ring, displaying the administrative routing number of a major credit card security division. Clara reached out her right index finger, pressing the speaker interface to initialize the voice channel, allowing the clear Midwestern accent of the fraud investigator to fill the quiet kitchen space. The investigator stated that the automated monitoring system had flagged a series of international luxury resort transactions originating from the Maldives, totaling exactly $48,000 for the initial phase. Victoria's posture stiffened instantly, her breathing growing short and ragged as she recognized her own secondary account designation being read aloud over the open speaker line. She adjusted her reading glasses with stiff, trembling fingers, her jaw clenching as she whispered that there must be an administrative mistake because Arthur was managing her retirement profiles. Clara responded in a flat, monotone register, explaining that the forensic document ledger analysis script had already verified the system access logs, tracing the digital signature back to a specific device. She stated that the metadata proved the authorization did not originate from a secure terminal in San Antonio, but was executed via an unauthorized remote server node during the midnight rotation. Victoria's body exhibited a profound somatic response, the color draining completely from her cheeks as the technical voice on the line confirmed that 3 separate retirement distributions had been processed without a physical signature. The systematic exposure of Arthur's operational fraud proceeded according to a strict linear progression of digital evidence screens on the synchronized tablet display. Clara Vance slid the interface module across the maple table, her left thumb maintaining a steady pressure on the master navigation pad to prevent the system from auto-locking the data trail. The terminal display refreshed, showing the raw metadata logs of the main server directory, where Arthur had navigated using a compromised general power of attorney file to bypass the safety protocols. Victoria Radcliffe stared at the glowing interface lines, her eyes tracking the exact electronic sequence where her own son had converted her long-term savings into active credit lines for his real estate venture. The definitive blow landed when a synchronized text archive from the device repository loaded onto the screen, displaying a direct conversation between Arthur and his financial associate. The text read clearly that the old woman had signed everything without keeping track of the ledger accounts, allowing him to deploy the capital into the Bellamy deal without drawing any immediate administrative attention. Victoria covered her mouth with her left hand, her shoulders drooping by several inches as the reality of the elder financial exploitation settled into her consciousness. The document proved that Arthur had systematically treated his own mother as an unprotected asset on his balance sheet, using her identity as a blank check to fund his luxury travel, while leaving her legally vulnerable to the Internal Revenue Service. The kitchen fell back into a heavy, absolute quiet as the shadow of a passing cloud swept across the window pane, turning the bright amber sunshine into a cold, uniform gray. The steam from the abandoned coffee mugs rose in a straight, thin column before dispersing into the dry air, leaving the space completely devoid of any domestic warmth. Through the glass panels, the bare branches of the oak trees stood rigid against the Texas sky, a quiet landscape that matched the complete emotional detachment in Clara's chest. Victoria looked up from the tablet screen, her face old and broken as she stated that she would no longer support her son's defense, giving her full administrative consent to the legal actions Clara was preparing to file. Clara Vance stood up slowly from the counter, her movements slow, measured, and entirely independent of the domestic parameters the Radcliffe family had attempted to enforce on her life. She reached down and retrieved her secure storage drive from the terminal interface, knowing that the evidence of identity theft and elder exploitation was now securely locked within a federal chain of custody. She walked down the quiet hallway toward her daughter's nursery room, her boots making a solid, rhythmic sound against the slate tiles as the system finalized the transmission. The silence that occupied her environment was massive and clean, representing the permanent removal of the Radcliffe Authority and the complete establishment of her own technical sovereignty. The dry, yellowing blades of fescue grass crunched softly under Clara Vance's left shoe as she adjusted her physical footing on the concrete patio edge. The weight of her 28 years settled heavily into her heels. Her right hand remained deep inside the right pocket of her linen dress. Her fingers traced the hard, cold plastic contours of the encrypted storage drive she had brought from the military base. The intense heat of the San Antonio afternoon sun registered at exactly 31 degrees Celsius, yet a sudden, freezing shiver traveled from the base of her neck down to her lower back. This was a sharp physiological response to the overwhelming glare that bounced off the glass tables. The air was thick and saturated with the cloying, sweet odor of caramelized hickory barbecue sauce and the bitter charcoal smoke rising from the massive steel grill where the caterers were flipping beef patties. A low-frequency hum rattled the wooden boards of the deck, a dull throb produced by the large outdoor speakers playing a continuous country track at 50 decibels to mask the underlying tension of the gathering. Clara did not look toward the driveway. Her eyes remained focused on the pale, sweating forehead of her husband, Arthur Radcliffe, as he stood near the beverage cooler, his fingers sliding along the smooth aluminum surface of a beer can. Her breathing remained completely steady, maintaining a measured, rhythmic rate of inhalation that prevented the slightest physical indication of her rising pulse. Through the dense air, the smell of warm lawn grass and insect repellent hung like a suffocating shroud. Meanwhile, the distant, screeching laughter of neighborhood children playing in the sprinklers provided a bizarre, cheerful contrast to her silent focus. She slowly pulled her right hand out of her pocket, her fingers adjusting the strap of her watch. Her gaze tracked the slow, predictable movement of her husband as he prepared to step toward the center of the patio to address their guests. This crowded backyard gathering was the calculated centerpiece of the public relations recovery campaign Arthur had designed to erase the administrative fallout of Emma's recent hospitalization. Clara analyzed the spatial distribution of the 20 invited guests with the cold, detached logic of an aviation maintenance quality auditor. Her mind systematically mapped their physical coordinates like inventory units in a compromised warehouse. She watched Arthur's mother, Victoria Radcliffe, standing near the mahogany buffet table. Her fingers played with her expensive gold necklace with a haughty elegance that was funded entirely by their stolen joint household assets. To her left, the invited real estate associates maintained a polite smile while their eyes cataloged every interaction between Arthur and the guests. Their presence was a silent testament to the corporate presentation that was already underway. Clara's inner logic processed the risk coefficients of her next action, knowing that the prenuptial property parameters remained secure, but the immediate emotional impact on her family would be severe. Arthur believed he had neutralized her technical defenses by accessing her mobile interface and wiping the common cloud storage account, assuming her logistics training was insufficient to bypass his security network. He was operating under the classic delusion of the narcissist, relying on the public trust of Pastor Jim and Mrs. Ramirez to insulate him from any legal accountability. Her mind held the exact metadata logs of the 12 fraudulent wire transfers, translating his comfortable smile into a clear statutory record of interstate wire fraud that crossed the state borderlines. She felt no hesitation, only the cold, mechanical necessity of an auditor executing a terminal command to purge a corrupt file from the master database. The fast country music cut to a sudden, absolute silence as Clara stepped back. Her shoulder escaped the grip of Arthur's hand with a fluid, calculated motion that left his fingers hanging uselessly in the hot afternoon air. Arthur's smile froze on his face. His chest tightened as his breathing grew shallow, before he attempted to laugh off the physical rejection by declaring to the guests that his wife was simply tired from her military duties. Clara Vance looked him directly in the eyes. Her voice was clear and carried across the quiet lawn as she stated that her fatigue was nothing compared to the 12 months of systematic financial extraction he had executed against their family. Arthur took a sharp step forward, his jaw clenching as his neck muscles exhibited a sudden, visible somatic spasm of panic, while his mother, Victoria, dropped her paper plate onto the grass. Clara did not stop, her words ringing out as she explained the mechanics of the operational over-invoicing scheme he had used to drain their joint accounts through the church development fund. She stated that he had generated 12 fraudulent invoices of $9,200 each to funnel exactly $110,400 into Victoria's private accounts. Arthur's face drained of color, his skin turning a pale gray hue as he demanded she stop making ridiculous, unverified accusations in front of their neighbors and Gordon Bellamy. He muttered that she had no proof of any financial irregularity and that his logistics consulting was entirely legitimate, his hands balling into tight fists as he realized the legal counsel was taking notes on her device. Clara remained completely unmoved by his anger. Her voice maintained an absolute technical flatline as she stated that the transfers officially violated Title 18, Section 1343 of the United States Code, elevating his local deception to a major federal wire fraud offense. The mechanical execution of the counterstrike began instantly as Clara raised her left hand, signaling to the legal counsel, Angela Ruiz, who stood waiting beside the heavy oak doors of the detached garage. Angela immediately depressed the primary override command on her secure tablet, sending an encrypted signal that bypassed the home router to establish direct control over the 60-inch outdoor television screen on the patio wall. The monitor illuminated with a sharp, high-definition glare, replacing the family photo slideshow with the raw document ledger analysis compiled through the forensic system. The guests gasped as the screen displayed the verified forged signatures on the power of attorney forms. This was followed by the exact bank routing numbers, showing the unauthorized extraction of $18,000 from the savings module. Arthur lunged toward the television terminal with a desperate, uncoordinated stride. But retired Detective Frank Delaney stepped directly into his path, his broad frame blocking the console with absolute authority. Arthur shoved Delaney's shoulder in a frantic attempt to reach the power cords, but the retired investigator maintained his footing, pulling a laminated badge from his pocket to signal the formal intervention of law enforcement. In that exact sequence, 2 marked police cruisers rolled to a stop along the gravel driveway, their blue and red emergency lights throwing a frantic pattern against the white siding of the estate. Arthur turned wildly toward the eastern boundary of the yard, his legs executing a sudden sprint as he attempted to clear the low wooden fence leading to the public sidewalk. One of the responding officers caught him by the collar of his shirt before his boots could touch the concrete, throwing him face down onto the grass as the metallic click of handcuffs sealed his arrest. The chaotic shouting of the fleeing guests slowly faded into a distant, muffled hum, leaving the sun-drenched patio of the Radcliffe estate in a heavy, suffocating quiet that felt entirely separate from the afternoon's violence. Clara Vance stood motionless on the concrete. Her right arm reached down to pick up the formal files, her fingers weaving through her daughter's baby blanket to shield her from the sight of her father being loaded into the police cruiser. The temperature on the patio remained at 31 degrees Celsius, but the hot breeze that swept across the lawn carried the faint, bitter smell of charred meat from the abandoned grill and the ozone scent of the active television screen. Through the wide iron gates of the driveway, the 2 police cruisers accelerated down the road, their sirens remaining silent as they carried Arthur away toward the county detention facility. There were no additional verbal arguments from Victoria Radcliffe, who sat frozen beside the broken punch bowl as the federal marshals began to place yellow evidence tape along the doors of her vehicle. Clara looked out toward the empty backyard, her eyes tracking the slow, rhythmic descent of a single autumn leaf as it fell through the golden shafts of the dying sun. The silence that occupied her environment was massive and absolute. representing the permanent removal of the Radcliffe influence from her daughter's life and the complete restoration of her maternal authority. The cold glass of the south-facing window pane felt absolutely rigid against the pads of Nadia Thornton's right fingers, sending a slow, steady chill up through the radial nerve of her arm. She stood inside her newly arranged home office in the Clarksville farmhouse. Her weight shifted completely onto her left heel, feeling the solid oak floorboards beneath her boots remain perfectly static and silent. The air inside the room was clean and held at exactly 18 degrees Celsius, smelling faintly of freshly cut pine shelving and the dry paper scent of newly organized archive binders. A thin, geometric line of pristine dawn sunlight cut across the bare plaster walls, illuminating the fine dust motes hanging in the silence and casting a long, pale shadow of her tall frame across the desk. Her left hand hung loose at her side, the muscles in her forearms still bearing the faint, twitching memory of her long years spent typing shipment data under the harsh floodlights of Fort Campbell. Outside, the steady rustle of the wind through the bare branches of the hickory trees created a soft, rhythmic background noise that was completely uninterrupted by the hum of military vehicles or the loud drone of industrial ventilation systems. She kept her eyes focused on the empty yard beyond the glass, her head remaining perfectly level as she let her lungs expand in a slow, calculated cycle of breathing that made no sound in the quiet house. Her fingers moved with a deliberate, microscopic deceleration as she lifted them from the glass, turning her body toward the center of her new space, where the morning light was beginning to dissolve the lingering shadows of the winter night. Her right boot slid forward by 3 inches, the leather creaking slightly against the grain of the floor as she adjusted her posture to face the bright horizon. Every muscle in her neck felt loose and unlocked, a dramatic change from the constant tension that had bound her shoulders during her years inside the Kensington estate. She breathed in the cool scent of the morning air, her mind registering the complete absence of the heavy, chemical cleaning products that Philip had used to hide his domestic tracks. The pristine silence of the early hours was a physical presence in the room, comforting and absolute. This absolute physical stillness was the final audited result of a long 11-month campaign that had systematically dismantled the social and financial structures of the Kensington family. Nadia processed the variables of her new life with the detached, cold logic of a senior military cryptographer, analyzing the collapse of her former marriage as if she were reviewing a finalized fraud ledger. The federal prosecution had executed its duties with an unyielding, mechanical precision, utilizing the metadata logs and the encrypted video backups she had secured to completely invalidate Philip's public defense. Philip Kensington had been convicted under the strict guidelines of Title 18, Section 1343, receiving a sentence of 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of bail or early parole. His mother, Yvette Kensington, had watched her entire estate crumble under a federal asset forfeiture order, her bank accounts seized, and her luxury vehicles impounded to satisfy the massive restitution demands of the court. The family's local church charity organization, which they had used as a nonprofit vehicle to route the $9,200 monthly maintenance invoices, had been officially stripped of its tax-exempt status by the Internal Revenue Service. Nadia felt no emotional triumph as she reviewed these variables. Instead, her mind cataloged the end of the litigation as a necessary system correction that had permanently purged a dangerous anomaly from her daughter's environment. The betrayal she had endured for 3 years was no longer an active risk to be managed, but a closed case file whose administrative details were fully settled and logged. She analyzed the final assets of her recovery, noting that the court had secured 98% of the stolen funds from Yvette's frozen offshore accounts. every step of the federal investigation had unfolded in perfect alignment with her cryptographic trail, leaving the defense lawyers with no leverage to negotiate a lesser plea. The complete bankruptcy of the Kensington estate was not a personal revenge, but the inevitable mathematical consequence of their choices. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe, her internal thoughts moving with a cold, smooth fluidity as she watched the last shadow of the old family name fade from her legal identity. The formal decree from the United States District Court sat displayed on the secondary terminal panel, its text declaring the absolute rescission of contract due to fraudulent inducement, without a single administrative loophole remaining. Nadia reviewed the technical definitions within the judicial order, noting the explicit language that invalidated every secondary instrument the family had manufactured through identity theft and forged signatures. The legal reality was comprehensive. The court had ruled that the $575,000 phantom debt overlay was entirely void from its inception, stripping the Kensington corporate estate of any residual interest in her logistics files. Her official transition to Director of Municipal Operations was formalized by an independent endowment board, granting her absolute executive authority over a private development fund exceeding $750,000. The defense counsels who had tried to corner her with settlement releases during the initial grand jury investigation had been completely excluded from the new residential perimeter of her home. Nadia recalled the physical reaction of her daughter during their final session with Dr. Melissa Green. The way the child's shoulders had dropped by 2 inches, and her breathing had become loose and light as she colored a drawing of a bright, sunlit horse. Dr. Green had explained that children from coercive households often internalize the abuser's violence as their own failure, but the systematic presentation of safety had allowed Isla's neurological patterns to return to baseline health. The somatic response within her environment was clean. The automated servers registered her new credentials instantly, locking the historical access logs away from any future corporate interference. Every word written in the court final decree had validated her independent standing, ensuring that no future claim could be raised against her property. She sat in the quiet of her office, her mind reviewing the legal syntax that had permanently severed her ties to the Kensington lineage. Her throat completely relaxed as she let the finality of the words settle into her chest. The mechanical sequence of her final retirement began as Nadia reached toward the side slot of the master control dock, her movements metered, fluid, and entirely free of hesitation. Her fingers pressed the manual release button of the secondary reader unit, causing the obsolete proximity card bearing the Kensington Laboratories emblem to eject with a sharp click from the housing slot. She lifted the plastic token between 2 fingers, her gaze remaining fixed on the industrial shredder unit that sat integrated beneath the stainless steel framework of the central desk. Without a single backward glance, she dropped the card directly into the high-security disposal slot, listening to the instantaneous grinding of the steel blades as they reduced the final physical link of her marriage to microscopic fragments of carbon composite. Her right hand moved immediately toward the main isolation switch on the wall, her fingers engaging the mechanical lever with a firm, downward pressure that permanently deactivated the legacy communication channels linking her database to the old estate servers. The terminal arrays responded with a uniform sequence of system shutdown logs, their cooling fans decreasing their velocity in a steady deceleration pattern that signaled the absolute end of the Kensington parameters within her suite. She monitored the progress of the final backup, watching the digital terminal track the compression of 23 years of military logistics records into a secure, encrypted offline storage drive. Every file was systematically indexed and locked under her private administrative password, ensuring that her professional achievements remained entirely under her personal custody. The hum of the computer fans died away completely, leaving the desk terminals dark and cold under the bright morning sun. She gathered her personal notebooks and placed them into the metal drawers of her desk. her hands executing each movement with a calm, deliberate rhythm that signaled the end of her transition. The final visualization of the system clear sequence reached completion on the central monitor, leaving the main workspace in the brilliant, shadowless glare of the mid-morning winter sun. The air within the new office remained perfectly balanced, but the heavy historical pressure that had occupied her professional life for 3 years was entirely gone, replaced by the deep quiet of independent operation. Through the thick glass panes of the exterior wall, the freezing winds of the Clarksville Hills were throwing dry sleet against the insulated structure, but the internal heating systems maintained an absolute equilibrium that felt completely untouchable. Nadia stood alone before the console, her hands resting flat against the clean metal edge of the station, while the low hum of the active processing units faded away into the background, leaving the space in absolute silence. The freedom that occupied her workspace was massive and definitive, marking the permanent establishment of her autonomy and the complete restoration of her individual identity. She turned her face toward the expansive horizon, her movements completely light as she prepared to close the chapter on her decades of logistics service. Nadia Thornton stepped out onto the wide, open porch of the Clarksville farmhouse, her boots clicking softly against the weathered cedar planks. She stood alone in the cool morning air, her fingers reaching into her jacket pocket to retrieve the silver military identification badge and the small red emblem of her aviation division. She placed the metallic items inside an old, empty tin box she had saved from her deployment, closing the lid with a firm, decisive snap before sliding the box into her pocket. She did not look back at the dark hallway of the house. Instead, her eyes tracked the movement of 5-year-old Isla as the child ran across the green pasture, her yellow hair catching the morning sun as she chased a pair of blue butterflies. The distant, joyful sound of her daughter's laughter echoed across the open field, completely replacing the heavy, suffocating silence of the old Kensington Manor. The cold wind from the nearby Cumberland River Valley swept through the tall pine trees, carrying the fresh, clean scent of damp earth and the promise of a peaceful afternoon. Nadia let her hands rest flat against the wooden railing of the porch, her chest expanding in a deep, full breath as the shadow of the old family narrative dissolved into the bright daylight. She stood perfectly still in the quiet of her new home, her voice low and steady as she spoke her final confirmation phrase into the crisp winter morning. I have redefined the metrics of my own military legacy, and the system now operates under my parameters.